Midnight.
Every 4 years, dozens of journalists travel to a small, unincorporated township in New Hampshire, just 20 miles south of the Canadian border. Why? To tally the very first primary votes in the nation, of course.
It's a real slice of Americana.
And this tradition has brought over 60 reporters.
At midnight, residents of Dixville Notch submit their handwritten ballots, and for a brief moment, all political junkies are paying attention to this rural community. Even at its height, the tradition never exceeded more than 40 voters, which brings us to the Balsams Grand Resort Hotel, where the voting happens. Its employees were the bulk of Dixville Notch's voting population for the past 60 years. After the 2016 presidential election, the New Hampshire Attorney General started scrutinizing Dixville Notch's voter rolls. This heightened scrutiny almost ended one of New Hampshire's proudest political traditions. I'm here in northern New Hampshire to find out what happened. The hotel first opened just after the Civil War, and today the property spans 11,000 acres, a golf course, and miles of ski terrain.
The Balsams was that place where rich people came and they had really nothing to do, didn't want anything to do with the local population. You know, sort of off limits to the common folks around here.
Tom is the son of Neil Tillotson, the previous owner of the Balsams, who began the Dixville Notch midnight vote.
One of the first things Dad did when he took the hotel on was to try and hire as many local people as he could.
The Balsams is a difficult property to maintain since it stands alone, tucked away in the middle of the White Mountains.
And it's big. I mean, we have to do everything ourselves here. We provide all of our own security, water, energy, the whole schmear. So it has a fairly significant overhead.
So when Neil Tillotson bought the property in 1954, it was in financial trouble and up against a tax lien. 6 years later, Tillotson moderated the first midnight vote. It began because he didn't want to keep driving over an hour just to cast his vote.
We weren't the first. There were other towns doing it back as far as the 30s. One of the reasons the press started coming here is because we had our own phone company. The physical logistics of getting out the midnight vote results and the picture were much simpler here than in other midnight voting towns.
The midnight vote grew to represent the beginning of not only the New Hampshire primary, but it was the start of voting season nationwide. Presidential candidates visited the resort to win over New Hampshire voters. Oh, here's a good one of Reagan and your dad.
Yep.
Would he talk about his political opinions, or would he keep that to himself?
Before the election itself, you got to have a pretty coherent thought process of who you're going to vote for and why.
Yeah.
We try not to telegraph that. That would be a spoiler.
Yeah, fair.
The history of candidates coming up here over the years has, like everything else here, it's sort of evolved. Back in those days, the primaries were spread out over 6 months, not compacted into 2. Candidates really felt that winning New Hampshire would be their ticket to continuing the process for funding, and that continued pretty much until the hotel closed.
The hotel closed in 2011, leaving the midnight voting tradition in question and the surrounding communities at a loss.
Well, immediately, was 200 plus jobs gone, all right? And you had several people like myself that have been working there for decades.
Ray Gorman lives in the neighboring town of Colebrook, New Hampshire, and he started working as a bellman on weekends for extra money as a college student.
I graduated in '79. The day after I graduated, I started working full-time at the Balsams as superintendent services. We lost all these different things with the Balsams. Local proms were held there. Town events would go there, especially if you had meetings. A local hospital had trainings, and it was very important to our community. I first met Martha. She was working as a waitress at the Balsams. She had just gotten a job there. So, we went out to dinner one night, and 15 months later, we were married. Typical Balsam story. Lots of people met their future spouses there. It was a good job. Reality economically is we're a very depressed area, one of the most depressed areas in the state. That's one of the reasons we so badly want the Balsams to get rebuilt and going again. I would do anything to get back in that lobby again just for a couple of years. But, I'm in my 60s now, so,
So they better hurry up.
Please.
Now we're going to pass the beginnings of the demolition. Well, as far as private land, this is the largest piece of private land that I've ever been associated with.
Les Otten is a famed ski resort developer. His involvement began in 2016, and similarly to Neil Tillotson's purchase in 1954, the property was in trouble, and he saw an opportunity to make it successful again.
By the early aughts, it became apparent that not having modern conveniences and the death of Neil Tillotson, Tom's dad, all of a sudden put the resort upside down by a couple $1 million a year. That unfortunately led to the resorts closing at that period of time. That created the opportunity some several years later for me to get involved and perhaps put this great lady back into shape.
But what about the midnight vote and that investigation into voter fraud?
Attorney General said, we really can't have those people on the rolls anymore.
The AG's office discovered several longtime voters were no longer living in the Notch full time, so they were required to change their voter registration, bringing the number of eligible voters down to just 4, 3 of which are Tillotsons.
The law requires it to be 5 simply because the law prescribes a certain number of election officials that have to be present to run an election.
With Les switching his permanent residence from Maine to New Hampshire, he became the 5th voter. Joe, the Balsams director of sales, is the 4th.
I think that the midnight voting always was symbolic. We can only do the midnight voting when there's 100% participation. One person doesn't get out of bed or gets sick or runs off the road and hits a moose, whatever, we can't do it. I've always thought of it as we're trying to send 2 messages. 1, it's the starting gun for the process, and 2, get out to vote.
And it brings some attention to us in a positive way. We felt very fortunate, almost honored to do it. I think it's a great pride in New Hampshire.
So the original ballot box, the voting in Dixville Notch signs will all be here, albeit 5 of us voting.
They won't have to worry about any technical difficulties when tallying the 5 votes in Dixville, but as the primaries continue, it might be worth asking why we hold on to these traditions in the first place.